Welcome to a very special 48th episode of the First Person Podcast. The world is opening back up, and gaming backlogs are clogging up with sweet savings from summer sales. Now, with the regular crew on a well-deserved break, we have some fantastic guests from the FPS community to take over. This month, we'll be taking a return trip to Disco Elysium in light of its recent final cut. And we have a trio of DE experts to act as tour guides. Don't be frightened or intimidated by them. These are fun and friendly fellows, and I, Patrick Dolan, managing editor of FPS, will be here with you the whole time. So let's not waste any time. Let's let these gentlemen and scholars introduce themselves, tell us your bona fides, and what have you been playing lately?
So I guess I'll go first. My name's Andrew Bailey. I'm a copy editor at First Person Scholar, and just started as an editor at Press Start Journal. I'm a PhD candidate at York University in the art history and visual culture program, with a dissertation focusing on recent histories around game art and art games and the way they've been talked about, mostly from the perspective of game studies, but also through curatorial studies and looking at some case studies of recent artists, like new media and digital artists who are working with game engines and kind of continuing on with the legacy of game art, I guess. I'm on this podcast, or I was asked to be a part of this podcast, because I have a chapter that's about to be published in an anthology on kind of video game metatexts and video game literature about Disco Elysium and Kentucky Route Zero. So I'm pretty excited to talk today on the podcast about Disco Elysium in light of that. And then I guess games I've been playing lately. I was lucky enough, my partner bought me a PS5 for my recent birthday, and so I've been playing Resident Evil 8 on the PS5, which has been really fun.
Just a joy to play through that game. I was really giddy when I played the, how many days it takes. It doesn't take that long to beat.
Yeah, you go through it pretty speedy, each of the little boss section areas, but I agree, very fun.
Cool. I suppose I'll go now. I'm Francis Buckworth-Parr. I am a third year PhD student at the University of Glasgow. My research predominantly is on the deployment of video games as metaphor in contemporary literary culture. I look at and am currently developing a literary theory for the deployment of video game as metaphor in contemporary literary culture. I call this macrosis. And that has kept me busy for the last couple of years, but some other things have as well. I am a Press Start editor. Press Start is kind of similar to FPS. It's a student journal. I was the co-organizer for the Ludic Literature, the Converging Interests of Writing Games and Play, and Digital Heroisms conferences. I have a forthcoming chapter in Ready Reader 1, the stories we tell with video games. It's on autobiography and addiction in Michael Clune's Game Life, a memoir. And the main thing I've been playing really is Warzone, Call of Duty Warzone, trying to play with my friends from back home, which we never do nowadays because we're all grown up and some of us have children or worse. And just sort of getting together and playing that and just sort of headshotting children. More sort of interesting games, I suppose, would be Disco Elysium. I think that's for me the best game of the 2010s, I think. And I'm really excited to talk about it today. And also, maybe a podcast one day on Resident Evil 8, a fantastic game that I've also had real good fun watching people play.
Ooh, metaphors in the new Resident Evil games would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, fungal dads.
Fungal dads?
Fungal dads, the best new dads coming to you hot now. Fungal dads.
Okay, I am Casper Schuster. I'm an electrical engineer, as it were, who works at Horizon Power, which is a public sector electricity corporation in Western Australia. And professionally speaking, I specialize in power system studies. And lately my work has been modeling the impact of cloud events on towns with increasing deployment of solar, which is a big thing in Australia. And as for first person scholar, recently I just worked up the nerve to actually publish a piece on Disco Elysium, which is called Rediscovering Politics in RPGs. And yeah, that is the reason why I'm on this podcast today. And yeah, I would style myself as really quite interested in the development of RPGs and real-time strategy games. And yeah, as for what I've been playing recently, because Perth was lately in lockdown, I was playing a fair bit of Dicey Dungeons, which is just like a very bite-sized game. But I also recently played a demo of a game called Peripetia, which is a Polish cyberpunk game, which has styled itself as a kind of homage to Deus Ex. And I've never played Deus Ex, so now I see a little bit of what the fuss was about, and I like what I see. Yeah, take it away.
Dicey Dungeons, I've heard so much good stuff about. I haven't heard of that other game you mentioned, but it sounds interesting. This is a little self-serving, but you did say you had to oh man, I can't even speak. You had to get the courage up to submit to us. How did you find the submitting and editing process?
Well, first of all, actually, my whole like inspiration to write something about Disco Elysium was actually I first tried to get submitted at a different journal, an actual journal, but that didn't work out. So I like spent like quite a few months actually like just planning after that, and yeah, I decided to go with First Person Scholar. And yeah, as for the editing process, it was, I guess, good to like pick up some discipline in deciding, how to hone down the idea as such, because yeah, after all, it has to stay to 2,000 words, and I'm very pleased with the result of that, and I do have you to thank for that, Patrick.
I wasn't fishing for compliments.
Yeah. I'll
Thank
give
you.
some compliments now as well. I also, incidentally, have done a first-person scholar article called I Learned Through Paradise or Disco Elysium, a brief etymology of Disco Elysium, where I look at the etymologies of the words Disco Elysium and kind of think about what it means to name a game. And the editorialship at First Person Scholar was fantastic. Very kind, very informed, very rigorous. Not afraid to tell you when you're talking utter nonsense, which is often the case with me. And they refined a nebulous sort of blind idiot treatise on these two words into something actually pertaining to Disco Elysium and Disco Elysium, which I have Patrick to thank for as well. So cheers for that, Patrick. That was a slog that you went through there. So cheers.
I loved both of your essays very much. I was prying with Gackford just because I don't be afraid to submit to First Person Scholar. Just submit it. We very rarely will reject something outright, unless it's like hateful. But yeah, you don't have to be a scholar. Just submit to us. And actually, Andrew too started as a submitter. I was the associate editor of his article, which is I actually I'll probably I think I've referenced his article, but definitely read it for like my thesis and other work.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I was going to say I have had two articles in the past couple of years or a few years before I became an editor at First Person Scholar. I submitted, and it's I would have to, anyone listening, I would encourage you to submit. It's a very helpful, nice, supportive process, at least within my experience. It's like very not the type of scary concepts that you can, or a scary process you can sometimes get with the higher tier academic journals. Like, we're very much willing to work with you along the way and kind of like make it be a conversation rather than just like telling you you're bad or something.
All right. And that's essays at firstpersonscholar.com. Anyway, guys, how did you first encounter Disco Elysium? I guess let's just start with Andrew again, and we'll go alphabetical order.
Sure. I can't remember. I know how I found it, but I don't remember the exact timing. But it was through something I like to do is kind of just like dredge or like kind of go through Steam and itch.io for things that are coming up, or like upcoming releases, and just my wish lists on both of those platforms is far too long, but it makes it easy to keep track of stuff that's coming up. And I can't remember exactly how I found out about Disco Elysium, but I remember just seeing screenshots of it, and the art stuck out to me quite a bit. I really liked the just on the Steam page, just the background art and the very painterly quality to it. My partner is also Estonian and really likes stuff to do with Estonian culture and Estonian art. And when I noticed that it was being made by an Estonian team, like that kind of combo of me liking the art and then noticing where it was coming from cemented it in my mind, being like, oh, I should pay attention to this, like when it eventually comes out. And I think that was probably like a good year or something before it actually released. So it was in my mind for a while before I actually had a chance to play it. And yeah, that's like kind of how I like kind of came into it. I was excited for it for a while, so it was like something that I played almost at like day one type thing.
I just really fucking like disco music. The main way I do so me and my friends, we've got this thing called Banger Alert. So if you're not au fait with this is where we find music and then we'll send each other a text, sort of Banger Alert in all caps, all shouty, and then we'll give it. Sorry, Patrick, what was that?
I was just saying, I love that. That's so awesome.
Oh, I'll add you in. It's it's massive bangers in there, but mostly my job is to sift through shit disco to find some of those juicy disco kernels. And I was looking on YouTube and something popped up about Disco Elysium, and I was like, I'd like to hear that. And then it turns out you can play it. It's a video game, so I found it completely by accident. I had a look at it, and again with Andrew, I was enamoured with the art, and then I started to do a little bit more research. Found out that it's a very prose-heavy game, like Planescape Torment, which is a game I liked, and I was sold. And it was sold to me. I bought it and played it. It was a very happy accident. It seems fitting that I came to it in some ways by accident through something as vacuous as disco, because in many ways Disco Elysium thematizes finding these cool little bits of being human in the vacuous.
This is self-serving. I'm also a disco fan. Do you have a hidden gem album that you would suggest for other disco fans?
Oh, well, I mean, if you're bringing the mash, I suppose I will bring the bangers. One of my favourites recently has been Mary Clark's Take Me, I'm Yours. No song in disco is worth listening to unless it's 8 minutes long. And this one clocks in at a smooth 9 minutes, I think. And it's just wonderful, syncopated, continuous fun and glory by a singer, Mary Clark, who doesn't really get played enough. So I'd say not an album, but Mary Clark's Take Me, I'm Yours.
Nice, thank you. And sorry, on to Kek.
I'm not really sure actually how I encountered Disco Elysium. I do remember like buying it relatively recently after it was released. I think I definitely heard about it on Twitter, and it sounds a bit embarrassing to say I bought something because of Twitter, but that might very well be true. But yeah, I definitely liked from what I saw, I guess, how sardonic and just like unexpected that stuff was. But the things regarding like it being made in Estonia and like reflecting a post-Soviet Europe, that kind of stuff, that only like occurred to me later, and that, like, I guess you could say that's like what kept me chained to Disco Elysium, as it were. Francis, I was actually wondering with your banger alert.
Yes.
Did anything by Idols ever make it on there?
Idols? No, not that I can think of.
Have you ever seen them live?
No. I must admit, I only like people who are dead. I often explain my music taste as I like what your dad likes, and so no, Idols. I don't actually know who they are at all. But it sounds like you've given me a banger alert, something for me to plumb.
Yeah,
I'll have a look for
based on
sure.
that 1 hour video call we had, I think you do kind of resemble the front man, Joe Talbot, and he's an absolute legend. So yeah, check it.
Oh,
Yeah,
lovely. Oh, I'll have
and
to have
he's
a look
very
now. I'll
much
have to see if that's a
alive.
compliment or God.
Very cool. I'm looking at. I feel like I might have seen them perform at like a New Year's Eve thing.
Whoa,
At New York. That might have been
What?
it.
What's the name? Sorry.
idols.
IDLES, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Let's have as many music detours as we can.
Yeah.
But actually, so how do you guys? You came to Disco Elysium in really interesting, kind of disparate ways. So how do you feel it compares to other RPGs? Like, does it play into a subvert norms of the genre? And anyone can take the question in any order now.
I'll go first if that's okay. But
Mhm.
like I played a fair few RPGs, but like not to a great level. I have a lot more affinity to strategy games, all told. But like, yeah, I guess maybe part of the stories with RPGs, I don't know. Maybe I get like kind of impatient. I remember it took me like 4 or 5 years to finish Baldur's Gate, which which I absolutely loved, but like I don't know, it took me a while to get into gear or something. But I guess like even Disco Elysium isn't immune to that, but it is unmistakably very different to those RPGs because equipment, experience, and optimizing your build, those things they have such a different meaning in Disco Elysium, and like one habit I've carried in like every single game I've played, strategy games and RPGs, is I save obsessively. But Disco Elysium was actually maybe the first game that wasn't really necessary, but it took me a while to like unlearn that because in Disco Elysium, failure is often more interesting than success, and yeah, it's actually good not to be too afraid of failure. I remember being obsessed with trying to get the body down. That is the part of Disco Elysium's plot, getting the body down from the tree on the very first day to prove that my character was turning a new leaf. But as it turned out, I didn't really need to have worried at the end of the day, and I was actually making the game less fun by save scumming, as it is called, saving before every dice roll and stuff. So yeah, I'm like trying to play the game again and not get too agitated about not making those dice rolls. But yeah, that was actually quite an eye opener to me, and that's actually been pointed out by like John Sawyer. He's a developer for Obsidian Entertainment. He praised that particular feature of Disco Elysium and the very intuitive nature of its dice rolls. So, yeah, that's just an anecdote.
I like what you were saying there, Casper, about its relationship with failure and how failure is kind of treated differently than it might be in a lot of other RPGs. It reminds me another kind of more anecdote. It reminds me of after I played the game and I was finished with it. I was very very excited by it, and I was kind of like wanting to. I had a few friends that like RPGs, like they really liked Divinity: Original Sin and some other things similar to that. And I was trying to recommend this game, and they eventually picked it up on this recommendation of mine. But we're having a lot of trouble in the early game, kind of trying to figure out because it's so different than a lot of other CRPGs. It doesn't really have a battle system. It's very dialogue based. It's kind of more similar maybe to adventure games or almost like a choose your own adventure book or something. But I kept on stressing like there's no matter what you do in this game, there's no real way to like fail the game. Like you can die or you can kind of reach a game over screen, but they're almost they're interesting as well. Like it's not like a reprimand or a kind of a fail state. It's just it's a one branching path you can take, and there's usually kind of humorous little ending blurbs along with those states. But I do like how the game, it's like you can kind of just muddle through. You're not there's no real way that you can make a bad build. You can dump all of your points into Inland Empire, the kind of the cryptozoology supernatural stat, and like the game will be just as interesting, if not more so, than if you tried to have more of a balanced build. So I like that a lot, but there's not really a bad build you can make, or you can't really shoot yourself in the foot early game with leveling up the wrong thing. It accommodates almost any play style.
Yeah, Andrew. Actually, when you mentioned like failure, that reminds me there is like one specific thing that can throw someone out of gear, threw me out of gear, and it's actually threw my friend, who I got her to play the game, out of gear, which is how you have to pay damages on the first night. And that's a bit of an adventure that really is like, it's amazing that like most difficult thing actually is such a mundane problem that you have absolutely no responsibility for, you know, as the protagonist. But yeah, paying the damages and like trying to find money some way, that's actually yeah, that was a real obstacle. More than getting anybody down from a tree.
Yeah, no, I like this pin to the question of failure, because I think Disco Elysium in some ways thematizes what is in failure. Failure isn't this thing that's emptied out. We actually we fill it with certain kinds of meanings, and we make the vacuous important. But also, I'm struck by how failure turns up already, and how, in many ways, us discussing Disco Elysium here is doomed to fail. We're going to fail to adequately describe this game because of something very clever that Disco Elysium does, I think. And this is true of RPGs generally, but it's acutely true with something like Disco Elysium. So we're shooting the shit here, but we're academics, and one of the things that you do, the grammar of academic writing, particularly for something literary or indeed ludic, is to give exposition. And because we need to say, we need to discuss or front load with evidence the things that we say. However, Disco Elysium is a text-based game to which we have no access to any of the text while we're talking here. And all we can do really is give vignettes. And in some ways, our conversation, I imagine, will resemble that of a shared dream more than talking about an actual tangible object. And I think this is deliberate on Disco Elysium's part. I think the fact that it's so textually heavy and wrapped in its own code and wrapped like a prose object that is in some ways the willing prisoner of a game, means that we will fail to do our academic job because it's not in the spirit of the game itself. We cannot give exposition. We fail to discuss Disco Elysium whenever it comes up. We cannot give you the evidence that you want, and I think that's a really cool and interesting challenge. Not just in terms of it being fun, but also in terms of how we discuss games. It pushes at the very limits of what we can talk about with games, which to me is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I mean, for the purposes of a podcast, yeah, maybe it's there's some limits there, but what you're talking, like, it makes me think of just some maybe like academic methodologies about certain types of role-playing games. It immediately makes me think of like having to access kind of like paratext, where people have uploaded the entire game script, like every forking aspect of the text that's in the game to like GitHub. And having that like available is amazing, but it's also this like enormously sprawling, impossible to kind of completely sift through, or not impossible, but it's this opus thing that you have to deal with, because it just because of its scope, it's so big, it has so many paths, and yeah, I mean, there'll be stories that'll happen in one of our games that won't have happened in another one. I know anytime I've talked about the game, I've kind of discovered something I've missed, or a path that I haven't been aware of that even existed. So it's interesting in that regard, just trying to find the common ground between us.
Yeah, like we've all completed the game, but we've probably seen such different events take place, and I can't say, for example, that anyone who hasn't got to the end of it has not completed it, and in some ways that shouldn't matter. But the common experiences that we often have when we read a novel, this forward, this linear experience, is kind of lost to us. And I speak to people about Disco Elysium, and they give me these vignettes that I didn't even know existed. But I've completed the game. Have I completed the game under these under this kind of logic? I don't know. And perhaps that's kind of the point. It's kind of this uncompletable and also unspoilerable game, because I can tell you what happens in it, but that's not what matters. What matters is the quality of the prose, the innovation in its game design, in incorporating prose and kind of giving prose back to sort of more stately forms of writing, in some way transformed. Yeah, it's fascinating.
I have a question. It'd be hard to summarize each one of our play experiences in any sort of totality, but I was trying to think of like one way to maybe each of us get an anecdote or like a framing for our playthroughs, and then I remembered I was going to ask what type of cop did you get categorized as in Disco Elysium? I guess for any listeners who haven't played, based on your actions throughout the game, it'll slowly try to give you a title of what type of cop you are. I got the sorry cop, and the description for that is like this kind of like sad, constantly apologizing like police officer who doesn't really have. It's very amusingly described. Like I was told that I was the hyper apologetic sorry cop. What about Francis or Casper? Do you remember the way that the game categorized your playthrough?
Not really sure. I think I was mainly a communist cop, but I remember once, actually this was a bit of a moment for me, but like a self-reflection moment, was that, you know how you have your cop ID, your profile, which lists like your badge number, your number of kills and things, and is that tally of how many statements you've made with respect to each of the copo types. So there's a communist cop, sorry cop, and other ones. But the one that scared me was that I realized I had 2 points in, I think it was like fascist cop, and that really shocked me. And actually, someone I read like in an article somewhere, someone who did not like the game, they were really unsettled by the fact that they had a couple of points in that thing. And yeah, I think I did like isolate one statement, and it's like one statement that your protagonist makes in the game, and it's like it was actually something quite subtle. It was something to do. It's like if you say something along the lines of like a positive support for the working classes, that's like a communist statement. But the other statement, which I think was might have been something about like international capital, but it was just broadly some kind of anti-foreigner sentiment, some kind of anti-foreigner sentiment that could be nested underneath that critique of international capital. That's what I think actually flagged the fascist copo type. I'm not super sure about that, but that was a bit of an eye-opener to me. And that's often the case, like in history, that you have countries like France which nationalize their industries, not so much necessarily in pursuit of a socialist objective, but more to keep them in national hands and to protect from foreign interests. So you can see how that can like go both ways in terms of placating an electorate. And yeah, that has relevance to today. Yeah, that's a bit of a tangent, but that did make me reflect in that path.
I don't want to cut Francis off, but I want to just like comment quickly on it. I really liked the way that you described that, Casper, because it makes me think of the game in a way that I hadn't thought about before. But you unintentionally like having to have backtrack and figure out maybe what gave you a specific point in a certain copo type in the game makes me like there's an element of the game almost reading as like a personality test or something. Like the way that you're playing it, it's giving you this mirror report or something. You can kind of see see this version of yourself, and or maybe not like directly yourself, but your play style or what have you. But it's obfuscating it a bit, so it's hiding it a little bit. Like you kind of don't always know you're making a choice, and so you have this like imprint of your play style afterwards that you can go back and try to decipher, which is like, I don't know. I think that's a novel thing. I mean, like there's other games that have aspects like Mass Effect or with its Renegade, like they have systems where you can kind of create an ethics character, but they're a lot more explicit. And I feel this game is not so explicit. It's weaved a little bit more subtly.
For me, I think it's like I was already taking the game seriously, so I did kind of took that flag at face value, and that's what made me interrogate it. But again, lots of people's mileage will vary, and they might not ascribe any importance to that. And after all, like Disco Elysium talks about ideology very explicitly, but that's actually ideology itself is a very difficult concept to communicate in Western countries these days. Mark Fisher and the world of capitalist realism and things. It's like so hard to even consider alternative or even consider how to put it. In a way,
Frederick Jameson one.
Yeah.
I think it was Frederick Jameson who said that it's easier to think about the end of the world than it is to think about the end of capitalism. And I suppose that's a kind of, and Frederick Jameson's a genius, and one of the reasons that he is a genius, I think, is because he talks about the remarkably subtle ideological relationships that comprise a neoliberal system, which is made so you can't talk about it. It has tons of strategies and techniques that means that you can't elucidate it fully, and it slips from you in a way that's rhetorically quite remarkable. So, like, having fascistic tendencies turn up in a game that are not immediately obvious is in many ways a key change from what we might consider to be the rote morality systems of games, which let's be frank, are not overly complicated most of the time. Usually, when we're pressed on an ideological character, they are saying the quiet bits out loud. Think about the racist
lorry driver.
Racist lorry driver, that's the one. Or Measurehead. These are caricatures of a far more subtle ideological tendency, but is far more obfuscatory than.
And it's also like self-serious. Yes. They are very self-serious. Measurehead is self-serious, even though he's so absurd. But I think that reinforces what you're saying.
Well, I actually am curious, Francis, you said originally just the idea of how the game is so wordy and so much about reading. And I was wondering, what kind of connections, I mean, you spoke about Frederick Jameson, who I also quite like, but also kind of literature. What other sort of connections or influences from literature or like other literary games like Baldur's Gate or the D&D RPGs do you guys see in Disco? Or Disco Elysium, rather, to be more specific.
This is a cop-out, really, but in the take source thread that cataloged Disco Elysium's development, the developers talk about Icewind Dale very favorably. They weren't really impressed with the game itself, but there was apparently a particular village that the game went into very particular detail to explore, which leads us to Disco Elysium and its depiction of Martinez, this shadow of an industrial district, and that's the whole map. It's just this one district, and it's 30 characters. So that's just a reflection, I guess, on. It has a very particular interpretation of just being open world, which is it's very dense and very detailed, and the developers were very explicit about that in the commentaries.
Yeah, I don't. Maybe this is probably more of a recent thought just because of some conferences that I've been attending lately. But at CGSA, Canadian Game Studies Association conference this year, there was a panel on the history of game books and interactive fiction and choose your own adventures and like stuff like the old fighting fantasy games. And I feel there's in the game itself, there's the bookstore and there's references to like TTRPG, like tabletop role playing games and board games, and I feel for how wordy, as Patrick was saying, the game is. It at times does feel the experience feels like kind of this hybridized type of reading a book, or and makes me think of the experience of playing. I haven't played a lot of game books in a while, but I used to play them like a lot as a kid. I collected the fighting fantasy books, but that type of experience where you're reading a lot, but you're also really like actively engaged in like the mechanics that the authors are constructing around the reading. And in that way also makes me think of, I guess, of adventure games. I know Kentucky Route Zero, the authors of or the Disco Elysium's game designers have cited repeatedly as an inspiration for their game, which is another very literary minded game that deals with capitalism and politics and stuff. But it's interesting because it's in between a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of history and game studies about the history of, the history of game studies, the history of interactive fiction and hypermedia, hypertext fiction, that type of thing. So for me, it's in that lineage of this like this new media approach to literature, like this kind of this like computized approach to literature, maybe. That I think my reading of that comes probably from my research focus in new media history, but. Anyway, I'm rambling, but
No, I wanted to shout out the Gamebooks CGSA presentation. That was from Luke Arnott, right?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. I want to just get his name out there. Okay.
Nice. Yeah, like I agree. I would also add Jennifer Egan's Black Box to that list of a kind of hybridized literary urge, or what conventional literature's urge to cache some grounding in social media and gaming environments. So Jennifer Egan's Black Box, for anyone who doesn't know, initially published on Twitter. Complete. You can read it linearly, and it makes sense as a novel. It might be a novella. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's a long form piece of writing published entirely through Twitter, originally at least. In terms of literary, the one that I can't get past personally, and I think perhaps I'm just beholden to one particular mechanic, but I think it's a mechanic that's done so well because in some ways it replaces the conventional party, and that's the fault cabinet, where your internal dialogue and the conflicting accounts of the world given to you by your faults essentially comprise your party. And what we have here is a series of very funny, very well developed archetypes. And I think of the great archetypical writers, and the one that really sticks out to me is Dostoevsky. So like Bobok, where the entirety of the short story takes place in a graveyard to which tons of decomposing corpses are kind of gibbering at each other. Or his unwritten, I think it's called Natoshka Nezvanova, where her Natoshka is a young girl, and her father, Ifremov, I can't remember now. It's an unfinished novel. He is this archetypal, artistically obsessed hack, basically, who has delusions of grandeur. And her mother is the opposite, gives so much of herself to all the other characters in the novel. Dostoevsky was really good at taking the things that we consider to be literarily conventional, perhaps even cliche or twee, and finding new layers and projecting voices through like I suppose when norms flock together, they become archetypes. Voicing interesting, different ways of looking at norms and values that, as I say, sort of come together to create an actual person. And it's through that collection in Dubois' head, which I believe is influenced by the works of Dostoevsky, that we arrive at such a complex character.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know why I never made that connection. I always thought of the thought cabinet as rather than being the like a substitute for a typical RPG's party, like a party of other characters. I was thinking of it as a reinvention of the equipment screen. But now I'm realizing that it makes perfect sense. That it's 'cause you have an equipment screen in the game, and having the thought cabinet be the party is really interesting. I don't know why I never had like framed it like that in my head, but I really like that kind of thinking of it in that way. That's great. As far as literary stuff, I remember right after I finished the game, I was looking for like to do with games like this that seem like it's a worthwhile venture to do. Looking on Reddit or Steam forums, people a lot of the times I did it for this game and Pathologic and Kentucky Route Zero, but people make up reading lists based on what they kind of were able to extricate from the game. And I found one that recommended China Mayville. I realize I've never actually said that the author's name out loud. China Mayville or Mayville. The Last Days of New Paris, which just to briefly summarize, it's a novella where surrealist works of art are anthropomorphized or animated into these creatures or people or monsters during like the last days of World War II in Paris. And there's a lot in Disco, but it makes me think of surrealist art and surrealist or like surrealist literature. I'm thinking of specifically, I don't know if anyone got to this scene, but there's a crate container at the docks that's very hard to get into. And you can eventually, if you figure out a way to unlock it, you find a person inside who's just so wealthy that they bend light around them. Like you can't perceive them because they're just too astronomically wealthy. And the scene, like visually, is just this wild, beautiful light spectrum thing that's happening. But it's just an example for me of there's a lot of maybe ideas or concepts that are, or like abstract ideas or concepts that are made material, or at least material within the game's world, in really interesting kind of surrealistic ways, or maybe even like sci-fi or fantasy as well. But there's this kind of a lot of otherworldly qualities that are really heavily contrasted with how maybe the more like realistic or serious elements of the game's politics and ideologies and depictions of its world in terms of like wealth and class and race. So yeah, that for me was like a literary quality that stuck out to me as maybe the imaginativeness of it, or the creativity, maybe like the magic realism or the surrealism or that type of lineage.
Andrew, I actually have something that could hook onto that idea you mentioned about that, like the magical realism of Disco Elysium is something that was discussed on Reddit, which is really interesting. I remember also, what you say about the man who bends light around him, and that's so funny. Your money actually literally skyrockets when you go in his vicinity, but it disappears once you leave the container.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, it actually ticks up, and it can become like 1,000,000 real or something like that. And if I remember, you can persuade the container to open, which is really funny. But the thing I was just thinking about now, like how also Disco Elysium is a diesel punk game, which is a really cool thing. I only know of one other diesel punk piece of media. Wasn't particularly good, but just to see this diesel punk. But the thing I was reminded of that links to what you're saying maybe is that on Reddit it was discussed at one point how the interface of Disco Elysium, how it resembles like tape film, you might remember, kind of and projections, like projected text. If you like read the margins, you can see something like a spec number and spec name called failed playback experiment. And in the context of the game, it's mentioned that failed was the electrical equipment company that was developing some very advanced technology, including a tape computer, a computer that would work with a special solution that you could write words onto tape and it would compute them, and it would be there's a beautiful, intricate mechanism. But then the Revacholian Revolution happened, and all of the failed assets were appropriated by the communists. But going back to that, how poetic is that the game that Disco Elysium is being played on is a machine that never existed. Only 3 copies of that tape computer were said to have ever been made, and they were all lost during the revolution. And here we have this interface that is, by all intents and purposes, that same interface of that tape computer. And that was just such an amazing correlation that was found. It's really so remarkable that it has to be true, but it makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, actually, that makes me think it comes back around a couple conversations ago, but like when we were talking about failure. But leading up to this podcast, I was listening to some other podcasts and YouTube videos about Disco Elysium, and I think it was in Noah Caldwell Gervais's YouTube video essay on the game, where he was talking about can't remember where he sourced this from, but he found a conversation, an interview that the head developers have done of the game, and that going into it, they were fairly convinced that it wasn't going to work, or it seemed like they were quite pessimistic about the outcome. None of them had ever really made a video game before, and I think they were maybe fairly I don't know, maybe wary or scared that it would fail. And I think that's in the game a lot too, through like what you're saying, like this like it's a game that never existed. It's kind of this meta commentary, maybe like about the status of the game, and there's the failed. It's like within the world, within Disco Elysium's world, like you encounter what's could be called the first video game company. Like they're trying to use some of this. They're trying to make this experimental video game that's you play through radio stations, like through calling into radio stations, and you get it's kind of like its own version of radio interactive fiction. But they failed as well. Like they failed in their project of making this, like within Disco Elysium, there's a game studio that failed at making an ambitious role playing game. And so yeah, I don't know. I think there's this at not pessimism, but just kind of this like you can see the outlook of the designers poking through, come at it. I mean, always like throughout everything, it's explicit in all the text, but like maybe a little bit more of like a meta commentary about the artistic process or the authorial process, or like authoring the work and how they thought about it going through it, which I really liked. I feel like you see the authors in Disco Elysium, or the designers or the artists, or however you want to qualify them as creatives, that you see them in the work a lot, repeatedly.
Nice. On that meta note, we're coming up on time, but I want to do a round robin and ask you each sort of what makes Disco Elysium so great? You know, what did DE bring to the RPG genre? As kind of, I guess, a way of wrapping up this failure of a conversation, as Francis might put it.
I think one. I mean, there are many things that it does great, but there's this autobiographical quality to it. To what it does great, which we don't have in literature as a rule. Like, I mean, I like modernist poetry, for example. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland's my favourite poem. When I read some of the lines in that, I don't know, revive for a moment, a broken Coriolanus. I'm struck by Eliot's big, sexy words, but I'm also struck by the rich interiority of T.S. Eliot's mind. It's something in him, Or if I look at another influence, I suppose, would be Hieronymus Bosch. If I look at the Hieronymus Bosch paintings, I'm struck by the immensity of their scale. But there's something about being implicated in Disco Elysium's beautiful prose, which you in some way bring about. Because the conversation that Casper and Andrew just had about this this case that you can open, I've never seen that. And this is a part of Disco Elysium that has gone past me, that wasn't part of my experience, but I want it to be, and that's kind of this limitlessness that it brings. But it's the way that Disco Elysium takes those rich interior parts of writing and implicates the player in them in a way that makes the game unspoilerable and in many ways indescribable. And so what I would just say to any of the listeners, if you haven't played it, listening to this conversation has told you really nothing about the experience that you will have. In some ways it's your own experience, but in some ways it's this shared vignette where everyone's talking about it in ways where we are, in some ways, are in dreams awake. It's very rare that we get literary prose fiction that is not in a novel of that quality. And that's what makes it special. That's what makes it so great. For me.
With respect to the question of what makes it great, for me, I've got to be like I want to be pragmatic about these things. So I'm quite preoccupied with like how the game is received and played and interpreted. And so in terms of that, all of this, wonderful detail we're talking about is great. But I'm wondering also like, how it is received by people who might not even identify as political people whatsoever, which is, when we're talking about gamers, is almost can be taken for granted. Yeah, so with respect to that classification, what I find interesting is the RPG genre is like a highly mature genre, which in its own, like the whole name, the role-playing genre, does not really capture the very particular forms it has. Like, if someone never heard of role-playing games and things, and you told them that an RPG, you expected to have levels, you expected to hunt monsters, you expected to go on quests, you expected to be very important, and all of that. There's nothing obviously natural about any of those that would happen through a natural language understanding of a role-playing game. But as it were, after 30 years of tabletop games and Dungeons and Dragons, and another 20-30 years of computer RPG games, we've arrived at that very particular concentrated meaning with respect to what a conventional RPG is. I'm of course excluding indie games and experimental games and things from that. But when we say RPG, it clearly means a very particular thing. So when it comes to Disco Elysium, and clearly it's been a massive, well, not massive, a really good success, let's call it. Definitely Zaum, the Estonian company that made it, can rest on its laurels for a little bit. But with respect to RPGs, I don't see Disco Elysium as revolutionary whatsoever. It's like it would be impossible. It's successful, but that means it kind of already fitted in that mold. So I see it as a conventional RPG, but potentially like a revisionist RPG, because it has some very key interventions in what it does and things that don't like massively upend our understanding of RPG mechanics, because after all, this is a game that has equipment, that has your stats, that has experience and things, but the situations in which you accomplish and gather experience and develop your character are so different to what you would normally expect of an RPG. So the thing is that Disco Elysium managed to get away with this incredible incredible detail with respect to ideology and history, the end of history, because it still kept enough traditional aspects of RPGs. But yes, the key thing that differentiates it, which I talk about in my essay, is the lack of a conventional combat system, and moreover the lack of mobs, the lack of disposable NPCs that can be harvested for experience. Because in RPGs like Baldur's Gate, you're going to encounter bandits, you're going to encounter goblins, you're going to encounter all manner of those beasts, and they will be harvested for experience, and they will regenerate, they will replenish, they will reproduce. Their existence in the context of a game is that they are inexhaustible to the player, but more broadly, within the game's story and such, they are a problem that can never be resolved. There may be a political problem, there may be a social problem, but there's some kind of problem that cannot really be definitively resolved because after all, the player has to keep grinding. That's really what we're talking about, grinding. So Disco Elysium doesn't have that. Instead of you're defeating your enemies and things, you instead just go through the motions of just talking with people, and you get rewarded for that in very unexpected ways and things. And why did that take? I'm not so sure, really. It's easy for me to say that it's worked, but it still really comes down, I guess, to a fair bit of luck, a fair bit of marketing, a fair bit of incredible production values, and how it's very much marketed with an English-speaking audience in mind, despite its Eastern European heritage. Sorry, I'm rambling again. I'm just saying I'm always preoccupied with how it exists as a product, right? Because that, in a way, already forecloses, how radical it could ever have been, is what I'm saying. So I'm glad it's succeeded, but in terms of its legacy may end up being quite harmless. Like, for instance, Disco Elysium has this, engages in a bit of truth-telling about the post-war period in Eastern Europe. It alludes to that. But in terms of how this game is going to be received in Eastern Europe, well, I don't really know because I can't actually speak Polish. But it may very well end up just being like a badge of pride. Poland has a few quite successful international games, but at the same time they are very globalized. They're very they like a certain context. And Disco Elysium is a lot more specific, but is it going to encourage a kind of self-reflection over post-war experience? Not really sure. Like, Poland itself is in a pretty bad place, so maybe Estonia would be a better country to ask. But it might very well be that us in America, in Canada, in England, in Australia, we will draw all of the significance from this game through like a kind of nostalgia we project on it, when the actual countries which owe nostalgia to this game, that the game owes its heritage to, I don't know what will happen there. And I don't know if that makes it doesn't make it futile by any means. I mean, we draw value from it. That's good enough for us. But yeah, we're seeing the beginning of a legacy here, and it might not necessarily be a positive one. It might, positive, negative. That's why I come back into this revisionist space, that in a way it could be a revisionist RPG, in that it sort of redefines some norms, and maybe in the future other RPGs inherit those norms. But what ultimately changes, I'm not really sure. After all, it is an RPG, and it can't really escape certain things. Sorry to be a bummer. That's of course I have a whole lot of other thoughts, but I think we always have to qualify whenever we say something is going to be great or is great.
I was going to say I feel like mine's maybe a good contrast to that, or maybe a lighter tone. But I think a lot of the things that I would have maybe tried to articulate around why the game is great have already been said to some degree by Casper and Francis about the game's maybe place in history or historical references and its RPG mechanics and stuff. But whenever I think about the game, and there's very few games of that I ever have a strong desire to go back and play, but this is definitely one of them, and one of the reasons that I do, or there's kind of a couple of reasons, but the main one that I think distinguishes it from a lot of other games, and we've talked around it, but I haven't maybe talked about it directly, but is the game's humor. I think it's very genuinely funny, and it's Francis was talking about the quality of the writing, which I think this lends itself to, but writing humor in games is something that I feel is rarely very successful. I mean, in the broader scope of video games as an entire a medium or set of products, or however you're wanting to define it. But like I'm just reminded of, I bought Borderlands 3 on sale recently just to play a co-op game with friends, and that is a game that at least tries very hard to be funny, but it's a very I would say unsuccessful, but I think
brutal. It's so brutal.
I think humor in games is an understated. It's hard to achieve. It's a hard thing to just have something that's as genuinely, like, sincerely funny as Disco Elysium is in so many times. I feel like it's rare that a game makes me laugh out loud. I can remember multiple instances where I did laugh out loud, and I felt compelled to talk to other people about like specific little vignettes that had happened and try to set it up. And I just, it comes back probably to the quality of the writing, and then maybe also just to do with the music, and just the vibes, the aesthetics of the game. It's a very I like being in that world, and I want to revisit it, and I think that there's just a lot of elements that contribute to that feeling. And I think it's, the writing is great, and just all the creative choices behind it make it something that I would want to engage with and re-engage with.
If you take nothing from this, dear listener, just know that this is an incredibly messy but incredibly interesting, intricate game to really chew into. But yeah, so that does it for us. There's so much more to be said about this game. But that does it for us for now. Thank you so much to Andrew, to Caspar, and Francis for reaching out and kind of organizing this, as well as Giuseppe Femia, Joey, to us for working behind the scenes and getting this going. And yeah, so where can we find you guys online or otherwise?
I'm on Twitter at Andrew_R_Bailey, Bailey, and as I said at the top of the podcast, I'm also an editor at First Person Scholar and Press Start, so would encourage any listeners to submit papers to both of those. And I think that's where you can find me on the internet.
I don't actually know what my Twitter handle is. I think it's Francis B. Parr, but it might be something silly like Eldritch Marmalade or something like that. I don't use it much, but it might be worth having a look over there and seeing. I tend to find stuff that I find interesting, post that. Good place for calls for papers. You can just use me. I'm on there anyway. So yeah, I think it's Francis B. Parr, but look for Eldritch Marmalade as well, perhaps.
Well, social media wise, I'm on Twitter as at Casper__Shosda, and I have a website, caspershosda.com, that is HTML markup, so that will direct you to anything you need. And if you're feeling kinky, you can find me on LinkedIn. Yeah, LinkedIn, the place to be.
Oh.
I still haven't figured out like a gimmick for LinkedIn, because I was thinking of like sharing tips from criminal enterprises, but I don't think the penny would really drop for people. So I don't know how to make a thing out of LinkedIn yet.
That sounds like a good YouTube series. And that's Casper with a C. For
KAC.
Yes.
KACPER, and Shosda is spelled SZOZDA.
All right, excellent. Well, Thank you for listening to First Person Podcast. Did we miss a detail about the game you really want to talk about? Let us know on Twitter at FPS Weekly, or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast on Twitter. Do you want to contribute to FPS or have an idea for a podcast or interview? Head on over to firstpersonscholar.com and check out our contribute page. First Person Scholar is produced by Giuseppe Femia and published by the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.